Good morning, friends. It's our usual definition of 10 a.m. here in, there in Redmond, Washington. And so time for .NET API review. Surprise! There are blocking issues, and different surprise, we're going to skip one until the people who are here to talk about it show up. So, first up becomes pass custom tags for metrics enrichment in HTTP client handler 86281. Anton, you with us?
He's saying in chat he's having audio issues.
I heard that, so it's okay. It's maybe on Jeremy's side, not on mine.
Does anybody else hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay.
Yep, we hear you.
I haven't touched anything.
Guess it fixed itself.
Okay, so are we hoping for Noah and Martin to join, because they also have something on the agenda, and if they would join, maybe the discussion would be more fruitful. Of course, I don't mind to discuss it with.
If you
or
mean
are they already?
If you mean the logger message thing, they said they can't show up till 11.
Okay. Doesn't matter. So we can discuss this, obviously. So basically, this is about metrics requirements for system at HTTP. We are implementing some counters in there, and there's a requirement called enrichment, which means that users would need to inject custom tags from their HTTP handlers, or even from code that would call send async on HTTP client, or even in diagnostic listeners. So whenever an HTTP request message would be available, they want to be able to inject custom text. So what are texts? Texts are, for example, the HTTP protocol or something like that. And in these cases, R9 specifically, or maybe other users need to inject custom text, for example, things that were fished out from headers. So, for example, you can see such a case in the API usage example. And yeah, so this is a per request thing. So they need to customize the text on per request basis, not per HTTP client instance. Therefore, we would need some API that is bound to a request message. Although for me, it would feel very weird if we would expose something directly on HTTP request message, because it's kind of a niche thing. So if I would go to the HTTP request message documentation and see something like custom metric tags, I would feel like, oh, what the heck is this? So my idea was that probably it's better to use the existing options value bag to store this stuff. On the other hand, it's like not very discoverable, so it's very hard to document, for example. So with Noah, we came up with this kind of compromise that why not to expose an extension method on the HTTP request options, or the HTTP request options which could deal with the options key and do whatever is needed. So the matrix tags list or collection can be exposed in a safe way. So I kind of described what this method would do. It would just find the collection registered with a specific key. If it's not present, then it would create the collection and just return it. So users could inject their keys, and obviously systemnet HTTP code would also look for this collection and use the registered tags for enriching the emitted counters. So that's all it's about.
So the name feels very broad and overreaching. Like a lot of people might have things called custom metrics tags. Is this really the best name we have for it?
I proposing some alternatives: get matrix enrichment tags, or just get enrichment tags, because the feature is called enrichment. I didn't come up with any better ideas for this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, you said the system is gonna, like the HTTP client is itself going to look for this.
Yeah.
So what does it do with it? Does it just inject them all directly, like it finds the current activity and injects these key value pairs? Because if so, then the name might be fine. But if
Yeah,
it's putting them in a
basically,
custom secondary collection called enrichment, then maybe it needs a better name.
No, it's for meters. No, so for instruments where enrichment is needed, for example, request duration, it will append this custom text to the list of standard text when we are emitting this counter. So when we are emitting, this was the request duration, and then we emit this custom tag. For example, we emit the org name. So all the request durations which are related to specific orgs. This would create dimensions for the analysis later.
So all of the metrics that the client handles it'll add these as tags on the metrics it's producing.
Not all of them. For example, it will not emit them for request count or, for example, connection count. So when we don't have a good way to emit this, like it's really depends on the implementation. We don't. So, but on the other hand, it would feel weird to me. So it's still like work in progress when to emit them, when not to emit them. Maybe we will only emit them for request duration, but we can decide to emit them in other cases as well. So yeah, it feels weird. I don't know if we can make this name better or more specific. Would feel very weird if we name it like set request duration matrix tags. I don't think we would need to customize them for specific instruments. So some text for request duration, some text for something else. In such cases, James Newton King has a solution to really re-emit these metric events and filter them in another way if it becomes a user need from or a customer need from R9. I'm not sure if it answers the question.
Well, because I think the counter of how many requests have been made, etc. I can say that's about the client, and the duration is about the request, and then it's going to apply it to the request because it's on the request options. So maybe if it's all metrics that apply to the request, but if it's only being hooked up on specific metrics, then I think it's better to not have public API. Like assuming that this, where it's like, oh, I'm just gonna grab a key or grab a name tag off of a thing that already has name tags. If you can't document what it does in a sane and forward-looking way, then it shouldn't be public API, in my opinion.
I think we can document in the very end. It's just still like kind of in progress. I can't answer right now. So for sure we will emit them for request duration, and it's very likely we won't emit them for other events. So I think in the end we can document it in the same way.
Because like if there's a request size metric that comes out, I would expect it to also be on that. And like anything that I would expect it to be on every metric that is produced from a specific request, as opposed to aggregated things like what's the total number of requests this client made. Is what it sounded like to me. And if that's the case, it seems fine. And if once it's more nuanced than that, then again, I just question the notion of public API.
I wish we had Noah in the call now, because he definitely knows more about this than me, about the R9 usage and about these kind of needs. But
right, but assuming that just passing in a string and doing a thing is possible, like this doesn't need to be public API. So once it's public API, I think it needs to be usable by people that are not on the call, and as long as it's a thing we can reason about, then it seems okay to me personally. But if it's only specific metrics are getting specifically opted in, and all that the docs are going to do is say, oh, we've wired it up to these 4 things, but not anything else, then it just gets weird. If you can't make a blanket statement, then I wouldn't do it as public API.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. So I'm totally fine not making this a public API personally. But what I feel from discussions with Noah, or with James, they really prefer to have a public API because that would deal with this magic key in a safe way. Because it's really weird thing to have this kind of keys, and it's hard to document them. So then
Indeed.
it becomes copy pasta in consumer code, in R9 code in this specific case.
Yep. But again, if it's a feature's being investigated and prototyped and whatever, then doing it with magic strings seems better than public API, because public API, once it's there, it's there. Magic strings, you can stick a number on the end when you decide that you want to try a different variation of it. All right. Anybody else have anything on this one?
We can always put numbers on public API. Live your best life. We could be calm too.
It's true. EX is forbidden, but numbers are not. Numbers are the recommended way of incrementing a thing that you cannot think of a better name for it. X509 certificate 2. Okay, well, I'll just leave the note that says ideally it'll apply to all metrics that are relevant to the request versus the client, and sounds like nobody's saying no. Done. Thank you, Anton. Next up is Anton with pass meter to HTTP client handler and sockets HTTP handler. 869
Yeah,
or
it's basically the same feature set. We need this for testability. So when when writing unit tests against matrix, which with HTTP client handler or sockets HTTP handler, so in general with system that's HTTP with HTTP client, we, or I would say some users, for example, James Newton King and probably R9 wants to see on which specific meter were the metrics emitted. And if it's just the global meter, it's very hard to write tests. You need to go out of process and this kind of stuff. But if you can check if the counters instruments were emitted on a specific meter, then you just set a specific meter in the unit test code, and then you can test check or validate whatever happened. So basically, this is the first case with system.net HTTP when kind of test focused APIs would enter this library.
What's the behavior if diagnostics are disabled? What does meter return?
It returns. You can enable instruments individually. So whenever, if there is no instrument enabled, it will still return a meter, a global meter. So it will be still a meter. And when you register some listener to specific instruments, then you can listen to them. So I'm not aware that you can disable metrics globally or enable them. It's on per instrument basis, as far as I know. Correct me if I'm wrong on this.
I don't know the answer, but I thought that there was a global. I thought the intent was that the code inside HTTP client handler that creates the metrics handler, whatever, would only create it if diagnostics were enabled, and it wouldn't create it if they weren't. But what you're suggesting is that it always has to create it because it doesn't know if they're enabled or disabled.
Yes. Unfortunately, you can enable meters on. You can enable instruments per instrument basis. So you can like start HTTP client, enable a specific instrument, and then you wouldn't need to listen to these events. So the metrics handler has to be there from the very beginning. If no instruments are enabled, it would be just forwarding the requests like some dummy handler, basically.
So there's nothing like what we have with diagnostics handler where you can disable it?
No.
And that's okay?
I don't know. Do we expect this extra virtual call to be very costly? I assume that it's not a problem, not necessarily. We can, of course, decide that you have to configure listening or enable instruments for a very beginning. So, but I think this is kind of an implementation detail, more discussion for the pull request I have.
It's also relevant here for minor things like, is this nullable?
No, I think it's not nullable because you need a global meter anyways.
But my point was if you would, I would expect if it was disabled that this would return null rather than some meter.
I think it's not how metrics work.
Okay.
Have we added metrics types publicly on anything? Or is this the first?
This is the first.
Because, we had perf counters in .NET 1, and we've gone through like 3 tracing stacks, and now we have a different way of tracking things like perf counters. I personally don't feel like diagnostics is stable enough API, since we're still writing it, that we should commit to it being an important types like HTTP handler.
It's a very valid concern.
So, I don't think this belongs. I think we need to not couple it as public API.
I've been told that meter is great though. James.
Yeah, the Europeans really like them.
Really likes it. I don't know. Like I've used it a bit.
I'll stick with feet.
I mean, the concern is really just basically every release we've had a new one.
Yeah.
Like we just released new counters a release or two ago, and now they're being replaced. So what's to say this one isn't going to replace next time?
Well, maybe we just have to commit harder by putting it in core types. Just make it work. Is there any? like, other than the fact that we've never been able to get a metrics API right before, which is a pretty strong argument, is there any other thing that's like wrong with meter?
For me, it's just
That would make
the instinct of the given that every couple of years we think I've got a better idea, and to just continue quoting Eddie Izzard. Oh, it's the same idea. It's the same idea. It's the same idea. So
I have no fundamental problem with it if this is the one.
yeah, I'm just always scared to do something the first time, and we've not, to my recollection, or apparently Steve's, added the new diagnostics types on any of our core types yet. It's been a standalone opt-in, use it in your utility code, but it doesn't affect public API outside of itself thing thus far. And I'm inclined to agree with a suggestion from YouTube chat that just use reflection and set it. If all you care about is testability.
No, I don't want that.
For tests?
For anything. I don't want anyone depending on... We tell people don't use reflection. And then to say use reflection.
Fair enough.
You can do that because the default will be a global and not an instance specific. So that would like already mess up tests which run in parallel. So the idea here is to have it per handler instance.
No, Jeremy meant use reflection to set it on the handler.
Yeah, but whatever is on the handler would be global if we don't expose an API.
No, he's
so
saying
you use reflection to set it.
He's saying there would be internal meter, not public
Right.
meter. And you'd set it via reflection. And I'm saying I don't want to encourage people to use private reflection.
We set the example, and yeah, people get broken when they use reflection because, of course, they do.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want anyone to use it in reality, but I guess if the only test concern for this was the thing we just talked about of I injected custom things, do they show up? Then I would expect that to be localized to the HTTP client handler tests themselves and not leak out past the .NET Runtime repository. If there's a concern that they really need to go beyond that, then yes, reflection is not the right answer.
The purpose of this is, if this were just about our own tests, this wouldn't be a discussion. This is not about our own tests. This is about other usage of HTTP client.
Fair enough.
I mean, in .NET 8, are there other types that meter is going to show up on?
iMeter factory. I mean, I don't think in ASP.NET we're like exposing it anywhere other than the factory at the moment. Like, we're definitely using it a lot.
Yeah, but I think like even iMeter factories exists or it's part of this story kind of. So it would produce a meter that can be then assigned to the handlers.
Stefan, why wouldn't this show up on ASP.NET types? Like, don't they have similar need for testability?
Yeah, they all constructor inject an iMeter factory. So
yeah, ASP.NET is using the DI scenarios. I mean, which is high level, which is can use iMeter factors there, can inject or get the iMeter factor from the containers. So they are using iMeter factor in ASP.NET.
So are we back to the question of why is an HTTP client handler based on iMeter factory, and then the layering question of why isn't it lower in the stack?
I would question about like what is the test scenario exactly we need to do there. I mean, with the HTTP client in this low level. I mean, like because like I'm just imagining about like HTTP client scenario. It just need to maybe listen to the actual meter there, not just overriding the meter or controlling the meter there. So I'm questioning about the test scenario itself we need to achieve here.
Like high level, just create a custom meter, assign it to the handler and listen to it and verify if events happened on it.
Why we need to do that? I mean, why you cannot just listen to the actual meter?
Because
whatever.
when tests are running in parallel, they will like fight with each other, for example.
So where
Do
the
that.
meter is get created in the first place?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Where the meter get created in the first place?
Where is the meter created? I think in test code, like in specific test cases.
No, I mean in actual product. I mean in the product itself. The meter get created in high level, I think, in the HTTP factory, right?
Yeah, for example,
Right.
if
So
you
so your test scenario should be in this level. I mean, like HTTP factory in the up level, which is can use the DI. And in this case, I think you can just control about using iMeter factors there, and you can.
I don't understand that. How
Right.
does the HTTP client factory create the handler if it can't set the meter on the handler?
With this API,
Yeah.
obviously.
Right.
But yeah. But going back just a second, you're like, why not just like write a listener in your tests? Like that's what we currently do in ASP.NET for like some of our event counter tests. And I'll tell you this, James has been working on basically replacing all of our event counters with metrics, and he loves not having to do that and just being able to inject like an iMeter factory, because there are issues with like parallelism and stuff. We work around it in our tests by means, but it's easier for sure when you can just supply the meter.
Yeah, we had all sorts of parallelism issues in the R9 code base when updating to this latest metering model. I'm with James. I didn't understand so given this API, what are the race conditions in tests? If each meter is distinct for each instance of HTTP client, there's no contention, right?
Yes,
Agreed.
Then there is no contention. If we don't have this API, then there is a contention.
Oh.
So that's
And
That's
there are
what we are
basically two
discussing.
questions. I think two questions on the table right now. One is the same debate we had before, which is meter versus iMeter factory, assuming you need to pass one in. And the second is, are we setting ourselves up for failure given that we seem to be going through diagnostics, counter metrics APIs like we used to go through data stacks, and a new one every release? Are we tying HTTP client to something that's going to be replaced in .NET 9?
I'd say it's not going to be replaced until .NET 10. Come on, Steve.
Fair enough.
Yeah, let's be
give ourselves
reasonable.
enough credit. We only do major diagnostic overhauls in LTSs, I guess.
So I think at the foundational level, things are stabilizing, and OpenTelemetry is the North Star, and tells you the features you need to support at the higher level, and that's kind of stabilized. So I think the higher level, there's a chance that these APIs are going to be longer lived from that perspective. They deliver what's needed for OpenTelemetry.
I agree, but I don't work on the product for that long time. So.
But let's see, what's the alternative?
I don't
No.
have one.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to be in a world where an HTTP client handler gets a gauge property in .NET 9 and I don't know, diagnostic instrument property in .NET 10.
Yeah. I think you have to roll the dice at this point, right? Just say, this is the best we know at this point.
Can we
Or
make
not
it an
put that in
experimental feature? Wait. It's only for new feature areas, though, right? You can't just do it on an existing API.
Well, I didn't hear the beginning of your statement, Stefan.
Oh, I just said, like, how we have feature flags for when this is for like introducing new assemblies and stuff, where it's like experimental flag. I don't think we can do that at this fine grain of a level.
We can.
Actually, that's the design intent. So
Okay.
you can stick an experimental attribute on any level of API, and it just says this can change. The
Beautiful.
only exception is on an interface type. That's not a good idea. But
I mean, if we're like doubling down on meter and it is the end all be all, and except for totally unforeseen circumstances, this is going to be the one that we have for the next decade, then I don't have a problem with it. I just don't want this to be, adding data table to HTTP client handler and then the next release data table's out of fashion.
so we are creating a lot of assets around meter. It's going to be everywhere in .NET 8. So
Yeah.
it's going to be
We're
harder and
more than
harder to
event
change over
counters right
time.
now. Like we're
Are
adding
any of those
more meters than
places-
event counters.
Oh, sorry, Stefan, say again. I talked
Oh, I was just pointing, like in ASP.NET, like not only has James pretty much taken every event counter and turned them into a meter, he's like adding more. So we'll have more telemetry, or not telemetry, metrics.
Are you killing the old event counters?
No.
Yeah, see, that's part. Just add more and more stuff.
Well, and then we'll just replace the way we make web requests. Though that we've only done once so far.
Not conceivably, you could at some point remove the event counter setting, like not set these event counters in ASP.NET Core, and have a separate component that's reading the metrics, and then emitting the event counters kind of on the outside as a legacy support thing.
Right, as a compat.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they don't always behave the same, because with meters
Well,
we
then, yeah.
comply to the standard, and with event counters we did whatever we did at that time. So
That's fair. That makes it complicated. Yeah.
Well, if Noah and Tarek and company sign in blood that this is the one for, as far as we can see, then I think this is reasonable. I still have the question about whether, if everyone else is injecting these via an iMeter factory, whether, like, why HTTP client handler and sockets HTTP handler are different, but
That is a little strange. I don't know if anybody can sign in blood. How about red Kool-Aid? That
how about phlegm? We can do phlegm. Different bodily fluid.
yeah.
Just to be clear about, like, we introduce iMeter factory mostly for DI scenarios. I mean, like, outside DI scenarios, we expect people using meters, not iMeter factory. So my question here is, like, this scenario that we are talking about here for HTTP client lies in which area? Is it in the DI scenarios or in general case scenarios?
I expect the system Microsoft extensions HTTP layer with HTTP client factory to forward whatever meters are created by meter factory to these handlers. And James has a prototype thing for this. He's waiting for my PR to be finished to prototype that. So,
But that's
so
just
those
Microsoft extensions being self-consistent. So that's fine and kind of not really data. Like
The
saying
question would be, is there anything else? What else at the core libraries layer at system.star in .NET 8 do we expect to integrate with metrics? Is there anything? Or is this the only one, and therefore we're just sort of putting our finger in the wind from a meter versus iMeter factory perspective?
I would say that if in the future, if we got any other scenarios in the system.star in the runtime, they should using meter, not iMeter factor.
Are we planning on converting system.runtime event counters to meters? Or duplicating it like ASP.NET does?
I mean, we already have a whole bunch of event counters that this is
Right.
going to end up duplicating, right?
Yes, I think this is going on work, yes.
mean, those are the only two places we use event counters ourselves, right? Is system.runtime, like the stuff from the GC and whatnot, and HTTP client.
We use it elsewhere in system.net.
Where? Thread pool?
DNS, for example. Sockets.
But for
So the value of going from event counter to meter is that you get dimensions, right? And for GC stuff, I don't think the dimensions are relevant. It's global.
even just to clarify about like runtime counters like GC or like memory consumption or anything else, usually this GC or they expose APIs which is produce this numbers, and the higher level libraries is consuming these APIs to get the numbers and produce the counters, the meter. And this is done today as like OpenTelemetry is doing that. I mean, just calling GC APIs and produce these counters. So low level don't have to use the meters. I mean, they expose APIs that give you these numbers, and higher level can use the meter to consume this API and produce the counters.
It's
so
because it's
low
global.
level
It's
like
it's
GC
global
or-
process state.
Yeah. So low level things they shouldn't do. I mean, like the guidelines is like they expose APIs that get the numbers they need, and high level they can create the meters and consume these APIs.
So, Jack, your position is this is what's on the screen is correct.
Yeah, I mean, on the level of HTTP client, yes.
Related to that, then, how is someone supposed to know what name to give the meter? Is that just documentation? We don't expose it as a static or a property somewhere that tells you what to do?
At the moment, no.
We have a documentation telling guidelines how to name your meters. Yeah.
But this is a complicated topic. I've opened a number of issues on this.
Mhm.
So we have existing customers that expect metrics with specific names. The stuff that's coming out of .NET is using different names, different dimensions, and for all the services at Microsoft, we need to comply with the Microsoft Common Schema for this stuff, which is not what's in .NET. So either we throw away all the .NET meters and implement our own around, or we listen to the .NET meters and we re-inject the ones with the names that we need, which is a burning CPU cycles for no good reason, or all of this stuff needs to be configurable so that we can do a mapping saying there's a logical name inside, but the thing that's going on the wire is this other name instead.
Currently, James prefers the CPU burning version. Maybe it's not that CPU burning in the end, so you can only prove it by benchmarks.
Yeah, so
burning or
I
not.
think that just the sniff test to me says this it's untenable from a performance standpoint. It's going to make meters. So if 100% of all meters used within Microsoft involve reading the stuff from .NET and re-injecting a different one, I think that means we have a broken system.
Yes, the Microsoft guidelines are obviously wrong and should follow the .NET guidelines. But the Microsoft guidelines shouldn't dictate what .NET does, because .NET is .NET, and Microsoft services are going to have to do one thing, and services at, I don't know, JP Morgan are going to do a different thing, and every company has their own standard, and that's a problem that needs to be solved. It's not fixed .NET, so no Microsoft standard has to do work.
I think that's
That's not what I said.
I think Martin's point about configurability is
Fair enough.
you want to be able to plug in the schema that you desire.
Okay, I heard the other direction. I apologize.
If you accepted a meter factory, the meter factory could handle the one-time rewrite, at least for the name of the meter. What about for the individual instruments? How would that work?
There is no way to configure them at the moment. So, I mean, no built-in way through the meter API. We could, of course, always expose environment variables or whatever stuff to configure them, but system diagnostic matrix doesn't have any mechanisms to configure individual meters.
And that's a real problem. That's why I worry about if these APIs here just have hard-coded meters, that seems to prevent this configuration coming in and adjusting what these behaviors do, what this stuff does.
I mean, it wouldn't necessarily prevent it. It just makes it more complicated in that you can't just inject your metric factory or whatever it is. You have to explicitly create the meter somehow and then set it on the handler. So it adds this other configuration step. But even then, it doesn't solve the internal problem. That only solves one name, not all the names.
Yeah.
The names are intended to follow OpenTelemetry guidelines, but I guess they're not absolutes. It's not just request per second. It's put your own name, your own prefix before that, and even then.
So there's basically three standards that in this space. There's whatever .NET's choosing. There's OpenTelemetry, which is different than what .NET has, and there's all the stuff we use within Microsoft itself, which is different than all the other two.
For the subset of .NETs that's intended to meet OpenTelemetry needs, why does that differ?
I think Noah was saying OpenTelemetry is not totally nailed down, so rather than being close to OpenTelemetry, let's just be different, and it's just different.
If we're different, how does a common consumer know how to? Does someone have to? I don't understand. Is there a mapping that gets injected somewhere in a consumer?
Nope. So that's the problem. So it's conceivable you do this mapping could be handled completely on the output side. In the OpenTelemetry stack, you could conceivably introduce just right before you send it on the wire, rename all these things. That might work.
Yeah, that's sort of what I meant by consumer, but I'm probably using the wrong terminology.
Sorry. But this just doesn't exist right now.
When are we going to have all of this figured out?
So I don't know. I was looking at some of this stuff, and now he's back on logging for the moment.
How does the naming work at all? Like, you can have multiple HTTP clients in your app, right? Like the HTTP client factory will make different ones. The idea is each one of those has a different meter with a different name. Is that the idea here?
No. The name should be for each of them system.http. So it's not the idea. The idea is these are just different instances, so you can set up listeners for the instances in your test code.
It's fine if you do change it though when you customize it though. Like by default, they'd all be system.http, I assume. But like if I wanted to put something
actually no, like at the moment we agreed to at least like validate it when you set this meter, and if the name is not correct, in my PR it will throw an exception.
What's the benefit of that?
Sorry?
What's the benefit of that? What purpose does the name serve, other than to enable you to throw that exception? Like, why couldn't I? What's wrong with me saying new meter foo?
I can't answer that. Like, from what I got, like that's
for
if it's emitted by this component.
For listening, I mean, like, anybody who wants to listen to HTTP client, how they know that which meter is really HTTP client?
Well, if I customized it, I would hope by setting a different name, I'm filtered out of the normal default HTTP client metrics. Like, this is my special HTTP client, which I want different category of metrics for.
Does it work? Does multiple meters with the same name aggregate together in an app?
It's possible. I mean, we don't.
It's possible, but does it do it? Like, because again, you're going to have multiple HTTP clients in your app, and so if you set them to different meters,
So we
With the same name.
created in .NET 8 allowing the meter creation to take tags, which is you can use. I mean, you can use the same name for all of them, but you can differentiate between them with the tags. Well, I mean the dimensions that we are talking about here.
So honestly, at this point, we're taking up a whole lot of time in API review to talk about what are deeper issues in the design of all of this stuff. Can I suggest we take it offline and have a real solid set of discussions around it?
Yeah, sure.
So for the shape, I'll ask the dumb question. I only know of 3 HTTP handler types, and 2 of them are gaining meter. Why is this on the derived types and not on the base type?
I was gonna ask exactly that.
Because we can only implement it here. So which is the third? You meant the base type, the client handler base type.
Yeah, the HTTP message handler.
I mean,
you can have a get set property on the base class. It's just
then
data.
we would expect. Then we would say that, for example, we expect WinHTTP handler to also implement it, and
any metrics.
It's very unlikely that we would implement it in WinHTTP handler. So it will be an op, and
sure.
It's not good.
It doesn't matter. It's the meter that it should use if it does metrics. It doesn't do metrics. Moving on.
For me, it would feel weird that it doesn't do anything, and actually, like, a handler is not necessarily doing metrics in every case. So it could be just like some retry handler, and we won't want different handlers to use different meters in a handler chain, probably. So these two, for example, in this case, what we want to do is to forward the HTTP client handlers meter to the underlying socket HTTP handlers meter.
And effectively, there's no distinction with HTTP message handler about whether you are at the end of the chain or you're somewhere in the middle of the chain. So we have things like delegating handler, which is a public type, because the whole purpose is you're plugging in a whole bunch of stages in your pipeline, and if every stage had its own metric property, or meter property, that would be weird.
Yes.
But doesn't the HTTP client handler eventually manifest a sockets handler, which is already having that same problem?
I don't understand the question. HTTP client handler and sockets HTTP handler are both, we control their entire implementation.
And like, wouldn't we want the delegating handler to, like, I mean, this would force it to be virtual, but wouldn't you want it to, like, forward the meter if it's like delegating to a sockets handler or whatever?
I think you don't want it would be strange to me if I have a a retry handler that I plug in on my thing, and somehow that has a different meter. So I'm not even sure why it would want its own meter.
How's it supposed to get the meter?
Why does it need the meter?
I don't know. It wants to meter something.
Well, that's a good question. Are the meter? I assumed that the things that are being tracked are specific to. They're only things that the terminating handler is capable of doing. Is that not the case? Are there things that someone else would want to participate in?
Like, could a retry handler not want to emit some sort of metric of I retried this request twice?
It can do it, and it would use the meter set on HTTP client handler. So currently, retry handler is an implementation detail.
No, but that's an issue. How does it get it? If these are
right, it has an HTTP message handler.
Yeah, they use
try as casting.
If you have a
but you might be 3 levels removed.
Right. If you have a pipeline of these handlers, how do they know what the origin handler was?
The top level.
Sorry, the origin
forward
meter.
So in this case, HTTP client handler will forward the meter to all the underlying handlers.
We're not talking about underlying handlers, Anton. We're talking about a whole pipeline of handlers that some third-party rights.
A chain of delegating handlers. Think about that.
Then those delegating handlers would need to forward the meter, but it would be their implementation. So I still not feel that then meter should be on the base type, because if you don't use it, then it's just weird that it's there.
But how do they
But
read
what about the inner message
meter
handler?
from
How
before
is
them?
It set it.
Yeah.
Like, sure, it can have its own property, but then on the inner HTTP message handler, what does it do?
I don't understand the question, honestly. So you
It sounds like from the call that there is a possibility of chaining these message handlers. How is the chain supposed to understand forwarding if it's each type individually has the meter? The second handler won't know what the first handler was and how to get the meter off of it so that it can create
I
instruments off
think
of the
like
same meter.
the topmost handler should be created with a meter set on it. Then it should forward it to the next handler. And
Okay,
this
but
way it should.
But how?
There's no metric on HTTP message handler. How does it forward it?
When the second handler is a delegating handler, whatever type that actually is, there's no property called meter on that type. So how does it forward it?
Yeah, but the delegating handler is actually some implementation of the delegating handler.
And it's in a third-party library. It can't cast it.
So then
It can't cast it to a concrete type. HTTP client handler will never know what the type is. It just knows the base class.
yeah, but the third-party library can implement a delegating handler which has a meter if it's a use case for them.
So HTTP client handler is supposed to do reflection to find out if there's a meter property on a delegating handler and then set it?
But the HTTP client handler doesn't take a delegating handler. So it can be a handler in the end of a delegating handler. I mean, HTTP client handler can be on the very end of the chain, but it doesn't take other handlers.
Okay. Well, whoever takes the chain, how is it supposed to forward the meter if the types it knows about, which presumably is just HTTP message handler, doesn't have a meter property?
The implementing types can. If it's a use case, then this seems like something that can be implemented in those specific middlewares which create the delegating handler, and then in the very end the bottommost. I just don't understand this.
So these handlers are all created to just accept the next one in the pipeline. They just accept an HTTP message handler that they should delegate to. That's how these chains are constructed, right? So like I pasted one in chat. I've literally just picked a random one out of the hundreds that show up in search results on grep.app. It just accepts an HTTP message handler as an argument to its constructor. I have no idea if this is good or bad one, but it's an example. So what is this one supposed to do? If it wants to track number of retries.
I mean, it could create a new metrics object that's just completely unrelated to the underlying metrics object, but yeah, I don't see.
And so the question is that the right answer? If that's the right answer, if everyone should do their own thing and they're unified in some way, or they're not if you use different names, then that's fine. If that's the model we're pushing. But if we want them to all be unified, then there needs to be some way of sharing this thing around. Which could be it's all based on a factory that hands out the same one to everyone. Or we say it's not actually an issue. But anyhow, I'll come back to my previous comment, which is we're no longer just looking at API shape. We're now talking about how things are actually supposed to work end to end, and we're not going to resolve that here.
I mean, a little bit of it is the question of does this belong on the base class instead?
Sure.
Which is
we
how
don't
we
know
got
what
there.
this is my point. What is this?
The meter.
On the screen, yes.
Yeah. No, so but I mean I think if the new HTTP pipeline stuff is supposed to be set up with this notion of delegating, then there's this question of what is metrics and metrics testability hoping to do for these pipelines, and if they can't answer the question with the API shape that's on the screen, then I think we have to bounce it back to them to say that they need to understand their scenarios and then come back with API that matches it.
I'm saying we need to bounce back the whole scenario to make sure end to end that it works.
Right. So you're saying call this needs work and move on.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm fine with exposing this kind of thing on HTTP client handler. I just want to make sure we do it the right way. We should do it in .NET 8. We should do it soon. But there are open questions about how this stuff is supposed to work end to end. It's possible there are answers for all that stuff already, and the folks here just don't know the answers. Great. But end to end, this should all work. Martin had some really real concerns around naming and how all that shows up here, and it's not clear to me. It's clear to me that just a meter property on this is not the answer from that perspective. So, like, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm pretty sure it's not that if we care about that problem. And maybe meter has the built-in mapping inside of it, and the HTTP meter, the iMeter factory allows injecting that mapping for all possible instrument names into the meter, and then we probably really would want the iMeter factory here instead of meter, because you want to be able to ensure that that same mapping takes effect. I have no idea. I'm designing on the fly.
Maybe this is implied, Jeremy, but I think it's a little more clear if you say pipeline of delegating message handlers. I mean, implied, but still.
I think Martin's questions around naming are also particularly relevant.
Like the naming of the meter, like the name you're passing in.
Of the meter and of the instruments, because it sounds like both are an issue.
So I think over the wire, what matters is the instrument name and the dimension, the tags. The metric name, I think, is just that's the drive configuration. So it's not a wire thing.
Yeah, one last question here about who is creating the instruments from the meter. It should be HTTP clients themselves, right? I mean,
Yes,
it's not the
yes.
user. So we control the name of the instrument.
But I think that's the problem that's being cited is HTTP client controls the name, it picks a name, and that's different than what existing consumers are expecting as the name.
Or at least
Did I
some
understand
existing
that correctly,
consumers.
Yeah, that's basically it, right? So, and different companies will have different standards, and you expect I have my Go code, my Java code, and my C# code, and they're all going to produce the same kind of things. And if I can't control these values, then I have an outlier. It doesn't fit the model.
But with the naming, can we just like go on and try and prototype the idea of James for republishing and see if it performs well enough? And if it's not, then we can introduce facilities to customize the naming, because I think it's like a big design problem. And
okay, so you can spend cycles doing this, and then you'll find that it's too slow. I just do the mental exercise. You're going to need to read a meter, go through a dictionary, do lookups for all the keys that you find, update them with something else, and then republish a new meter value. So you've gone from updating one meter value is now costs you at least twice as much, plus the manipulation in the dictionary.
You can make it like a zero cost thing, right? Where if you don't use it, it's pretty much free. And I feel like it is a more general thing where, like, you know, Kestrel, you know, or ASP.NET hosting, right? You might want to change some of those counter names to match like whatever, you know, Go's doing for its HTTP server, like if it doesn't already match.
Yep. But we have moved on, so those are good things to discuss offline to help make sure that the shape of all this stuff matches what we want, but this isn't the right forum. Okay, Tarek, since you're here, does that mean you want to do the logger message attribute now?
Yeah, I think Martin had some feedback on that. I mean, he wanted to bring it back and talk about it.
Okay, so logger message attribute constructor is 87254.
Okay, so basically there was some comments saying we need to see some example of what the ceremony is like. So I've got, if you scroll down, there's some code there. So basically, I want to just add some constructors that lead the developer to write less boilerplate stuff. Right? So the one on the section on top is using the new constructors. The section on the bottom is using the existing API surface. So there's just more characters typed by the user, and without any actual value brought to them. And we generally want to encourage patterns. We want to encourage structured logging rather than just unstructured logging. So having an overload that doesn't take a message is a good thing. Have it, as I mentioned above, in the real world, event IDs aren't actually useful in services. So I want to support not requiring an event ID. So right now, the existing constructor either forces me to specify message, event ID, and log level, or nothing at all. At which point, then I need to fall back to the property-based constructor model, which is quite a bit more verbose.
I didn't quite understand, Martin. If we want to encourage people to not have bespoke messages, why would we add a constructor that encourages passing a message?
That's fair. I originally added all the constructors, all the permutations of constructors, and because these constructors are cheap, that have no runtime cost, they're trivial. We do have still a lot of people that are using the messages, so it's just making an affordance for that case. But yeah, if there's a fundamental objection to adding all these overloads, at the very least, the one that's just supports the log level would be the minimum I'd ask for, at least.
So one thing that came up is in the last time the API reviewed this is that we still want to encourage particularly library developers to use Event ID. I know there's like some conversation in the comments is like, did we really design this for ETW? I'm not sure we did, first of all. And second of all, like even with the console logger, like I use the Event ID sometimes, right? It makes it very easy. You can just search for like category name bracket, Event ID bracket in like your standard out.txt and it's there. It's convenient. And I would be sad if library authors didn't use Event ID.
So which Event ID do you use? The numeric Event ID number or the name?
Both. Category. So in the console logger, right? If you look at the output, it's category, open bracket, Event ID, close bracket, colon, space, message, and you.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the implementation of the logging generator that parses this stuff automatically injects an event name that's derived from the function, the method name. So that's always there. the event ID, the numeric number, that number is the one that's not useful.
Well, it shows up in the console logs, right? I don't want it to be -1 all the time.
Yeah, so but you still have the event names to do the filtering that you're looking for.
Okay. I would have to double check. In ASP.NET, we typically, like, we very much do want to use event ID on everything. Like, I didn't even know that the analyzer had been downgraded to info, so we might have to change our settings to upgrade that. But typically,
but like I said,
the event name's
want
not
to
in the
do
console
this.
log output, right? It's the event ID. It's the number.
So these numbers tend to not be stable necessarily over time. You can't really write filters for those things. They're not documented. It's just stuff you see in the log. They don't reach the telemetry backends. So in a real system, these values are it's actually just overhead to compute and maintain and shovel all this data around. So the use case seems to be strictly for console logging?
I don't think it's strictly for that. I mean, ETW is apparently the original use case, which I don't think is true either. I think it's just a general thing that you want a log ID. And in ASP.NET, we do try to keep those consistent as much as possible. Like, you know, ASP.NET has broken APIs before we've broken logs. Like, sometimes the old logs aren't relevant. But, like, if we stop logging something, we leave a gap there, right? And we try to put all our log messages together and make sure we're incrementing IDs. And like, you're right that it's not well documented, but I would say it's pretty stable.
So fine, ASP.NET does this. Libraries that are using this logging stuff do not. There's no enforcement. There's no consistency guarantees. So the point is, you're making users type stuff that's not necessary for them in their code. For there's just no real reason to make them type this extra stuff.
Yeah. So regarding the entire idea behind this proposal, we have a do not level guidance. That is, do not have constructor parameters for attributes that accept settable properties. So if a property is settable, it should not be a constructor parameter. That is a.
So isn't that already? Aren't we already violating this?
This type is currently violating that, yes.
Okay.
But
just making sure.
So
this
constructor is a violation of guidelines.
The original version of this attribute came from R9 in the .NET 6 timeframe. The signatures were changed from what we had in R9 to, in fact, the original R9 would have complied to this rule. So somehow that it was chosen to explicitly break the rule.
Yeah, I had convinced myself last time that what had happened is event ID, level, and message were get-only properties, not get-set, and that later they became settable, and that's why the default constructor was added. But when I looked at the history of the file, it looks like it was the other order, so I don't know why we allowed the non-standard, the thing that's a violation of a do-not guideline. But I'm just pointing out.
What's the rationale for that guideline?
That in general, attributes are not evaluated at runtime. They're evaluated by a compiler or a static analyzer engine or something, and every time you add another overload, you have to teach it what that does in relation to the properties. Basically, it's just don't have two ways of doing the same thing, because you need to make systems understand that the event ID parameter in the constructor is the same as the event ID property, and you have to map that for everything, and people are bad at combinatorics. So don't make there be combinatoric approaches.
Okay.
It's a runtime versus analysis / build time problem in general, but that is the things that are attributes generally are supposed to adhere to that pattern.
I can comment on that from the runtime perspective. It is incredibly expensive for attributes to have multiple overloads, and parsing all of them and figuring out in which instance they are set via a constructor or whether they are set by a property.
What does incredibly expensive and incredibly expensive when?
When what Jeremy was saying, like at runtime, if we need to extract them and look into them, it's expensive to figure out how they were how they are created, because every creation of them is slightly different.
That's fair. Okay, so I would request that there's a little more subtlety be added to the guidelines. So this is an attribute specifically designed for code generators. So there's no runtime cost for this. And in fact, the way I've been creating these attributes is to put a conditional thing on it so that the attribute doesn't even show up in the final IL. So this is purely a usability thing used during compilation time. By one specific tool, the logging generator that's parsing this file.
That's not true. You're designing it for one specific tool, but you don't know who all is going to use it. It's public API. Once it exists, it exists.
If there's a quick explanation, I'm very curious why the overloads have a runtime cost. I figured you'd already like compile and you're like constructing the object anyway. But the other thing I wanted to point out is like we have several issues over the years about like, and mind you, this is hard, and both of these are in future because of the abstractions, but people want to be able to filter by event ID. This is something I've heard like a lot of people ask. So discouraging people from using event ID is not the direction I feel like we should be heading.
But look, you've already got an overload, the constructor overload that takes no parameters, right? And so if I don't want to use a message string, I need to use that overload, and I'm gonna this is not a self-consistent position.
Well, it was made less consistent by downgrading the analyzer from warning to info.
But it's inconsistent just by the fact of having the empty constructor.
The empty constructor means you need to set things via properties, and if you don't, the analyzer triggers. But now it no longer triggers.
Okay.
Isn't it just info level, or did we stop at triggering altogether?
Well, info level doesn't trigger during command line builds. It shows up as a blue squiggle in the ID if you're using Visual Studio.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And I'm not weighing in one way or the other. I'm just sort of providing facts.
Okay, so it's basically the guidelines say don't do this, so we don't do it.
That's my opinion.
We factored in. I mean, personally,
if we had
we're already living
go ahead,
in a world where we have a constructor that takes things. So given that this type is already effectively violating the guidelines, violating it a little again doesn't seem like a huge deal. The thing that I'm more concerned about is just by adding additional constructors that are easier to use, we're pushing people to use them. And is that the thing that we want to do? Do we want to encourage people to not use ID? Do we want to encourage people to specify a message? I think those are the questions to answer, and then that dictates what we do. If we're really okay, like we really want people to provide a custom message and not an ID, then go ahead and add a constructor that takes string message. That doesn't seem, given that we already have one that takes an event ID level and message, it doesn't seem problematic to me. But it's problematic if we don't actually want people providing a custom message.
Yeah, I think if there was the new one universal pattern that people should be following, and we wanted to add the one constructor, and we go from one against guidelines constructor to two, I would roll my eyes and say okay, but adding three suggests there is no universal pattern, and then the answer is people should just use attribute property assignment. Because there are other properties than just these three, but these are the three that were highlighted as the most important and the most common, and that this was the universal pattern, and now it's like, well, so are these three, which means it's not universal.
So I had all of them before and decided to remove, so following a comment from Tarek, remove some.
Right, but like, if the answer is absolutely everyone should always be setting a log level and message maybe shouldn't be limited, and you feel like having the debate with Stefan of whether event ID should be there, and log level is the one, then okay. But saying, well, we don't think message is a good idea, but some people like it, so we're going to add this too. It's like, well, to me, that's now we just go fall back on the guidelines, and the guidelines say we say no to all of them. Like, you need a convincing argument to override a guideline is the thing, and saying like, well, people want to do things differently, I don't think is enough of a convincing argument. This is the one true pattern I say is a convincing argument.
I guess I was focused on the user experience. That's all. So this is not introducing additional semantics to the capability, to the overall capability of this view. It's making it easier to use. That's all. So I thought usability was an important criteria of these API reviews.
It is, but so is consistency. And again, you're saying we're designing it for one generator. Well, it's a public API. Somebody else could have a better logger message attribute generator, and now they have to go understand the various mappings of these constructors too. So it's pushing more work on more people.
It's the intent is to the two people that need to parse this versus the million customers that need to use this. I'd favor the usability for the million customers.
I can appreciate that argument, and if we didn't have guidelines and me being an incessant rule follower, I would probably have a different opinion, but I start with the guidelines because I like having things written down. And again, like I know I said it, but if there was one and we say because this is the universal pattern, then I would find that a much more convincing argument than let's do the combinatoric explosion.
By its nature, there's different patterns.
Right.
Were we proposing a message only one too? What would have been the default log level? Still none.
So the way the code generator works is if you don't specify a log level in the attribute, then you are expected to specify it as a message parameter, as a method parameter. The idea is that this makes it possible to have the log level as a dynamic thing. And we have a similar behavior around the event ID as well. You can specify the event ID also as a parameter instead of as an attribute thing, and it'll pick it up from there. So the idea is, in general, these things are static, but you can also make them dynamic.
The log level I see, though, it's a little weird for an event to change log level. Has anyone ever changed the event ID at the call site while using the source generator? Like at that point, you might as well just use the regular log method. I
haven't seen that happen. But the log level is definitely happens. We have several components where the customer of the component can say, when this thing happens, please log at warning level instead of the info level. So the component needs to be able to set this value dynamically when it's logging.
It's probably, if it deserves a different level, and I was reviewing the PR, I would say that's probably a good sign that it needs a separate event ID. But again, it's different when you're writing like a library versus an app.
All right. Does anybody want to say yes to any part of this and just tell me to shut up?
I guess I don't count.
Well, I already knew you. But
do we? I don't know. It seems like we're approaching this from different perspectives in terms of consumer. There are different consumers, and we want to encourage them to do different things. And,
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then I would, if it were me, I think I would say, put whatever constructors we want, and then encourage people to set all the analyzers that are relevant. And I'm a little sad that we downgraded the one from warning to info. But we would tell any library author to put it back up to warning. And there are others where we do that. We have analyzers that are off by default, but we really want them on for library authors, but library authors represent only a, pick a number, 5% of the population. And so we tell them to do the extra work to configure it. We already have a constructor here that takes stuff and one that doesn't. So we're already in the bucket of specifying things multiple ways.
Like, I do think particularly like the message only without the log level, where you're changing the log level with the call, while it might be a real scenario, it's certainly not a common one. I think it's just like where we're, finding the balance. A no message log, again, it's probably fine for an app. And you would hope that library authors would know to include messages, because people are going to use the console logger sometimes.
I thought we were saying that we encourage people to not have messages.
Yeah, certainly
Really?
within that's our direction within E&D, because they'll rely on this instead of using the structured logging. It's much more expensive in the back end to use the message string. You rather have the queries be done on the tags.
So like ASP.NET's going to have messages regardless. I think, again, yeah, if you have any public consumers of a library, it seems like a very bad guidance, because I don't think that interacts well with the console logger. I haven't really tried it.
Well, part of the problem is the console logger is overly simple. I have a different issue open to fix that. So the console logger, for example, the console logger right now does not output the tags.
Sure, though,
So that's a problem.
or the scopes by default, if that's what you're talking about.
No, I'm
You
talking
can-
about
you
the
can
name
enable
value
scopes.
pairs.
Yeah, okay, from like the object, like if
Yeah.
there is one. Yeah, I mean, sure. But like it's also the default logger, and it's like more or less the same thing as the debug logger. Like it outputs text.
So
Right.
the idea is simple. You have a log method name that'll say socket can't open is the log method name. That is all you need really as the log message. When you're looking at a log line, it'll say log can't open socket, and then there's name value pairs to describe the parameters that go with it. The incremental value of having a formatted string that said the socket could not open because of error 22 is not helpful. It's just extra processing overhead end to end to format this stuff and send the string around and all that things. So just having the method name and the parameters that go with it is all that that we need in production.
Right, and if you know which loggers you're working with, fine, like logging providers. But like a lot of the most common ones, right, don't log the event name. And if we're not using the event name as the message, because it does log the message, then it's like it's a very bad user experience if someone's not very clear about what their logger providers are and what they're working with. So it does seem like a pit of failure not to set a message for like most, even app developers, unless they really know what they're doing.
So my request is, we already have the parameterless constructor where you set whatever you want via the properties, and presumably that's what most people end up using. So we're already in a situation where people set only the subset they care to set. Given that, the constructors don't really change anything, and what I'd ask us to do is think through exactly for each different audience what we would encourage them to do, and make sure we have analyzers in place at whatever default level we want, but that we would encourage them to turn on that guide them to use this appropriately for whatever their situation is. And I don't know what appropriate is. It sounds like Stefan has a good sense of what we want it to be for libraries. Maybe it's specify everything. You need to specify log level and ID and message, and therefore you should use the constructor that is there that makes it easy to do all three, and the analyzer tells you just do that. And then for app developers, it's don't specify anything or whatever. I don't know, but yeah.
There's an event name property, right? Distinct from event ID. On the
It's part of the event ID object.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just looking for my unmute button.
yeah. So, but the attribute breaks that out. Like it's got an integer and a
Right.
string, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and for some reason the event name is not set as a constructor parameter.
Well, I feel like that's the thing that defaults to
comes
the
from the-
function name, but if you
That's the design.
you can set event name to override that behavior.
Yeah.
Do we consider doing anything like if we really want semi-unique IDs, like derive an ID in the generator from the event name?
Well, I had explored originally when I wrote the generator to just use like sort the functions by or just based on the order of the functions that are declared in the source code. So that's 0, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3. That made it not stable over time. But using a hash would make it stable. It just gives you big numbers.
Nothing wrong with big
It's
numbers.
not a bad idea though.
Yeah, do like XX hash 32 with a seed of the ASCII representation of logger, and ta-da.
I mean, it's what for example event source does. Not that event source is the paragon of design, but you know, initially you were encouraged to create a GUID, and then the guidance basically never use a GUID when you're creating your event source. Just let it derive it from the name, and it manufactures a GUID based on the name using a stable algorithm.
I kind of
Okay,
like
so
that.
would that be a breaking change?
I mean, it would end up
Technically.
changing all events from -1 to something else.
Yeah,
But
so
apparently people didn't care about the -1 anyway, right? Like if they're using it.
I think that's a fine that's a fine plan.
I'm okay with that personally. Like if it was going to be -1, just like hash the event name. Sure.
Okay, I'll add that to the generator.
Alright, so are we adding the 3 as proposed?
Oh, well, hold on. The other 2 that I had that got deleted from the original proposal also had event ID as another permutation. If we care about event ID, then these permutations would be meaningful as well.
I don't think we need all of them. I still think like level only is
Suspect.
and message only. It's interesting. Like how many people are setting the level on every call? Like is
No,
there any internal
specifying
code
it-
that does that?
Specifying it in the attribute means you don't specify it in the method signature.
I'm looking at the last one.
Oh, fair enough.
Like that's I just can't imagine anyone ever using that ever.
No, we have. I'm guessing there's probably in the internal online code base. I'm guessing there's probably 4 or 5 uses of that.
Of
And
you've
it
fixed the
defaults to- I
message.
understood it defaults to a log level, or it forces you to specify one on the call.
It forces you to specify it explicitly.
And that one's then used because those 4 or 5 want to vary the log level based on call site.
It's typically based on config. So it's a library, and whatever the application wants, like this thing, I consider this a warning, so I'll put at the warning level.
I see.
That makes more sense than use the same log ID, and if the number is bigger than 30, then switch from info to warning.
In ASP.NET, we've always considered that an anti-pattern. Like, people have asked for options for like every single one of our services to change like log levels, and then they also want to do it by like event ID, and like that's where you get to like the other two issues I linked in chat. Like, our answer has always been to like hunt it and be like, yes, but there's nothing about this service that makes it like specially needed here. Like, if because you can listen, right? Like, you can filter, obviously, not by event ID, but by category name, like the various log levels.
But this goes back to the same discussion as for metrics, metric names. Ideally, you'd want this control to be centralized. Just like you can for C# compiler warnings versus errors. Right? The compiler has a suggestion, and then as a user, you could say, nope, treat that as an error.
Right, but that's logging configuration. That's not something you want to have to add to options for each of your services.
No, correct. I think that ultimately that's the right solution. That doesn't exist. Therefore, you have this onesie twosies when you need it.
I agree. Like, yeah, I can see why people want that given the gap, particularly based like you can't filter by event ID. Like, if you could and then like change the log level or something, which is what one of those proposals is, then it would be less necessary. But that's not the situation we're in. I'll give you that. I'm okay with it. Like, I mean, using the logging source generator is fine. Like, is kind of an advanced-ish scenario. People want what they want. If they're missing something, they'll realize it's because they're not specifying it.
I mean, using any of these constructors, you can then just do open curly event ID or event name or skip enabled check.
Don't use the
equal
message only attribute, because like, yeah, having
I'm just gonna put this where I keep looking for it.
The severity change for a given event ID. I mean, it's not the end of the world. I'm okay with it.
So what happened today if somebody specified the event ID in the attribute and specified the same in the log message, say, as a parameter?
So I think I made a mistake. We don't do this magic happens for log level and for something else, but not for event ID. So
Okay.
Because event ID is just an integer, and it's not going to automatically say that this integer parameter corresponds to the event ID. For log level, it's unambiguous. It says if you specify the log level both in the attribute and in the method signature, it gives you a warning. And so you need to specify it just in one place or the other. Oh, that's right. Okay, so the other magic we do is with exception, right? So if in the method parameter is of type exception, it says, oh, that's different. It gets put into the exception field of the ilogger.log method, or not field, but the parameter for ilogger.log. So it's treated separately.
So, yeah, the one thing that I would kind of like, and I'm curious whether you're okay with this, Martin, is if when we're logging there is no message, like I think it defaults to the empty string, could we just make it the event name? Like, I think that's going to be more usable with the console logger, right? Like, I'm just trying to think about how it looks if someone does happen to use the console logger or the debug logger.
Yeah. So I looked at this like a year ago to understand where the costs were, because I think if you specify this, so if at least the string does not do any formatting, you're saving a little bit there. It's just a plain string. But I think you still end up paying the cost of transferring it everywhere up and down the stack. As opposed to if it's just not there, it doesn't get sent anywhere.
Right, it doesn't get sent over the wire. It's like one less string. Yeah, I mean, that's why I asked, and that's why I was curious what you thought about it. I'm just more focused with the person who's like in Visual Studio and and just didn't realize that, yeah, this is better in production to not have a message because this is how our, structured logging works. But
Okay, so but I think what you're coming up with is the console logger needs to be improved.
and like anything else that's like text based, like anything that basically just like serializes the message and like writes it somewhere, whether it's like the debug log or the console log or whatever.
Right. Yeah, so in fact, yeah, that's right. I was looking at the console logger last night. It explicitly says if message is null and exception is null, skip, do nothing. So in fact, I suspect you get nothing on the screen if the message
Right, which I
string
don't
is null.
love. Yeah, like maybe that's what you want. Like maybe, I don't know, maybe, internally we're like, this is a feature, not a bug. And
No, it's a bug because it's not
Yeah.
accounting. It's not dealing with dimensions.
Yeah.
So I have no message, but I have all these dimensions. Please print this to the screen.
Right, and I do agree that it would be nice to have a mode to print all the dimensions, kind of like we do for scopes. But anyway, that's not this API review.
Okay. So I will be checking in a console exporter in OpenTelemetry that does all this stuff. But unfortunately, I think we're running out of time to do the same in the .NET console logger. That'll be for .NET 9.
So returning to the question at hand, do we want these three? Do we need more? Do we need fewer? Do we need different? Or do we just say it's good enough and move on? Hearing no dissent.
Somebody just say yes, let's move on.
Hearing no dissent, it is approved as is.
Thank you.
Okay, is this the issue that Fred wanted to be invited to? Do we have enough time to talk about it?
It's the one that Fred wanted to be invited to, and Eric St. John, and they had a huge conversation offline. So it's probably best that we have both present.
And if it involved a huge conversation offline, it's probably more than 10 minutes.
Certainly at our current speed.
Yeah. Okay, well then, if we have someone from interop, then expose options to only generate one direction for generated COM interfaces, 86360.
You have all the people from interop, so we should be able to do this one.
Cool.
Especially because we always just give blanket approval to anything that includes the letter COM.
No, we talk about it for 40 minutes trying to pretend that we understand, and then when our heads explode, then we just say approved. We're going to try and skip the 40-minute part, though.
Yeah. So this proposal focuses on giving some more control to users for the source-generated COM. Right now, if you say this interface represents a COM interface, we force the source generator will always generate the wrapper for a managed object, so it can be called from unmanaged code, and a wrapper for a COM object, so it can be called from managed code. We want to provide users to have the option to say, I only want to be able to wrap a managed object, or I only want to be able to wrap an unmanaged object, because there's a lot of COM interfaces that you're either consuming or providing an implementation of, but not both. And we decided to go with the flags enum here because we figured there are future options we may want to add that would be opt-in for the user, and we didn't want to have to add multiple different sets of enums for the various different options.
Okay, so we should name the zero value none, but other than that, I don't think I have any feedback.
The only thing is if we name
Um,
it, like, none is just going to end up being a diagnostic. Because we're going to say, you told us this is a COM interface, but you also told us not to generate anything.
Sure,
so
but
we're
I
not
mean,
going to generate anything.
someone can write
But yeah.
0, but right now that would ToString
That is
is
true.
0. So,
Yes.
you've defined this as a get-only property on a sealed type. Is that intentional?
Yes. It's a get only. Oh, yes. Oh, we need to add it to. Yeah, that should be getting set.
I was going to say, presumably somewhere you want to be able to set it.
Yes. I got very. Sorry. I'm so used to adding getters and putting in constructors. But this one is just going to be settable. Yeah. There we go. And we named the members manage object wrapper and com object wrapper to try to make it clearer so people know what's being generated. Because we were initially talking about like doing like managed to unmanaged or unmanaged to managed, and that was causing confusion. RCW and CCW have always caused problems. So we're trying to come up with a terminology that's a little bit clearer.
Would someone ever specify none, or is that just to have?
It's just to have.
That's just to have. The generator would emit a diagnostic saying, you told us to do nothing. So that doesn't make sense.
Out of curiosity, in this API proposal, why is the attribute sealed? Because it's not in the source code, right? Not that it matters a whole lot, because it's already there.
Is it not sealed in the source code?
I mean, it should. Otherwise, the generator is going to have to look for anything that possibly derives from this attribute, and then it wouldn't be able to do anything special with anything that was on the derived types.
Well, it's supposed to be sealed.
Yeah.
Oh,
was
we
a
can
mistake.
fix that at the same time.
It probably should be sealed,
Yeah.
yeah. In fact, during the discussion of the last one, someone in YouTube chat asked about unsealing the type and said the same thing of it kills the compiler perf. Or the tool just ignores the derived types. That's the other option.
But do we need to add constructors? Ducks. No, I'm just kidding.
Asked and answered. It's a settable property. Alright. Anybody else have anything on this one? Sold. Alright. Here, I will even close the tab so that Fred doesn't have to see his issue pop up and then us not talk about it. Alright. Steven and Tanner, do you think Big Little Indian GUID writing is 10 minutes?
No.
It depends on how fast we want to get through the. Yeah.
I think that sounds like Steve has more than 10 minutes of argument in him. I will
Yeah.
accept nominations for a fast issue.
87449. We have Stopwatch today. We have a debugger display string, but ToString itself just prints system diagnostic stopwatch. And there have been several users, including Dan, who have asked that we have ToString just print the elapsed time or print the same string as the debugger display does. That way it's more useful for example, you want to console.writeLine how long your operation you just measured took.
Seems fine. And we just say if you want to do any configuration of the output, you just use elapsed instead.
Yeah. And does it matter to show if it is running or not while doing ToString?
That's basically the open question of do we want to display it's running like the debugger display does, or does that matter? I'd imagine that the most common scenario for console output is they just want to display how long it took and not the current status of whether it's running or not.
Okay, so showing 0 would be okay. I mean, it doesn't matter if it is running or not.
Yeah, I would match timestamps.
Right, that'd be my thought.
Or wait, is that not what it matches? That's the alternative design? Oh no.
No,
You're saying
that's
it
what
could
the
use a
proposal
different-
is.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fine with the proposal.
Is stopwatch sealed?
I think so, but I'm not positive.
No.
No. So if somebody doesn't like it, they can overwrite it themselves, which is already true.
Seems fine.
To my knowledge,
Nothing on the class is virtual.
Except
Except
But
for
it does have a
ToString.
public constructor.
But yeah.
except ToString.
And
To my knowledge, we don't generally care in API review about adding an override to a virtual member. Unless you just think that this is a good group for having a discussion of the do we care about printing is running in the ToString. But
Well,
I'm fine with calling it
was
approved. It
also,
just feels like a kind of thing that doesn't actually
yeah.
require API review.
It's kind of a new signature, but there's also kind of this related topic that came up in that there are the default behavior for classes and value types that don't override ToString is it just prints the type name. What is the general feeling for an analyzer that flags calling ToString or formatting or passing a type or passing the value of a type into, for example, iformatable, etc., that where the type does not override ToString and just issuing a warning for it.
if it's like object, I wouldn't want that warning. But if it's like a derived type that the analyzer knows is like in the current project or sees the source and knows it's not override, it seems like a bit heavy-handed. I thought you were going to suggest an analyzer that's like if you have a debugger, ToString or whatever it's called, to also override ToString. Because like this comes up a lot. Like a lot of times people are like, "Oh, this like debugger view is nice. Can we just make that the ToString?"
I don't think I want that. But we can have a separate conversation on a case-by-case basis about whether something should override ToString. But like many of the debugger displays are not what you would want if it was actually in a ToString. Like lists debugger display just shows count. But if we were going to override ToString on list, I'd want it to show the elements. If we were going to
I think the debugger should probably show the elements too, but
it does, but not in the debugger display. You have to expand. One click to expand it to get the nice dialog that lets you scroll through all the values.
That makes sense.
Debugger display does not equal ToString. It just defaults to ToString.
And even here it doesn't, right? It wouldn't be checking that the implementations are the same. It's just like, oh, if you thought it was useful enough to have a debugger ToString, then people probably would like to see something other than the class name when they ToString it. It's just generally
there are of course other implications as well, and maybe they're not huge, but like debugger display is trimmable, ToString is not.
That's a good point. And like, yeah, if someone was already printing it, like maybe they did want the object name. Like, so there's always things.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we want to talk analyzers, I think that there's an interesting, an analyzer for you have a provable type, whether it's that it's a sealed type or you called new in the same function. So you know exactly what type it is. But you have a provable type that doesn't seem to have a override of ToString, and you're implicitly ToStringing it. That seems like a fine analyzer in general to have. You would need a different one.
I do that on purpose in a bunch of places. Like I was expecting object type string, I didn't get it, so log or print out the object to get its type or ToString information in the log, in the debug assert or whatever.
Fair. I generally do object type get type full name, but yeah.
That's more reliable. But like, I think the analyzer wouldn't raise if you're doing object ToString, right? It would only be if it's in like a derived type.
Right. You couldn't do it if it was a unsealed base type where you couldn't know.
Well, that limits its usability a lot because, like, unless you're a struct or a sealed class,
right. And so that's where I was going to say you would want a different diagnostic ID so that it was differently tunable, or I guess just a configuration parameter for I'm flowing the middle of a type hierarchy, and it may or may not have a toString. And so I think that there's room for an analyzer to help people realize that when they get around to running this log that they're writing, that it's just going to print a type name and not any values. But I don't know. It definitely is not something that should be, on and a warning by default, because it's not always the right answer.
Right, and because Stopwatch is not sealed, that analyzer wouldn't catch this based on that description.
Right, and because most people create Stopwatch with the start new static accelerator, an analyzer wouldn't even know, like, oh, this is guaranteed an instance of the Stopwatch type and not a derived type. So it would be the second code of like, there might not be a toString here versus I know there's not a toString here. So I don't know. It could be useful, but it's probably one of those things that's just going to have so much noise that nobody would use it in the end.
Well, even in that case, I mean, if someone's using ref assemblies, there are a bunch of places where we don't have erroneously or not, we don't have overrides listed in our refs.
Mm-hmm.
So even if it did override toString, you might not know it.
I mean, they should, because the Roslyn compiler still thinks that when you write base.whatever, it should ask where's the base.method method currently implemented instead of just writing the static call to the base type.
Maybe you should, but not necessarily. I mean, I'm 100% certain we have places still that don't.
Right. But I know we don't bother wasting the metadata for specifying non-required overrides on a sealed type, but an unsealed type should always be specifying its overrides for base calls. But many of our ref CSs were edited by hand and may still be missing data.
So we're at time. I haven't heard any objections other than like this might not even be API, but I think we're all good with it.
Yeah. I mean, the analyzers are an interesting idea, definitely a different discussion. And I guess technically adding this would change the ref CS, which would trigger the notice that it has to be API review. I just think in general we don't. If all you're doing is overriding a thing, that we don't care. We'd care if, we'd have a debate if somebody wanted to put a new string property on it. We'd be like, why don't you just define toString? So, all right, cool. Well, for anyone who was watching for whatever issue we didn't talk about, sorry, maybe next time. And so, thanks everyone for sticking with us, and see you on Tuesday, our same .NET time, same .NET channel. Auf Wiedersehen.